Today, of course, we have as our guest Rabbi Micah Greenstein from Temple Israel. I have told many of you that what I find a lot of things impressive about Micah. Most of all, I think I love how he is usually thoughtful and usually in the next breath funny. So a thought and a quip from me in his honor.
Oh no.
I was told this week. This is the thoughtful part. The better part comes next. This is a good one though. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Wow.
And I think Micah always reminds us of that in many different ways, and that's why we're reading Job, isn't it? Because we're in this with Job. We're in it together. Now, the other piece. I was talking to him recently, and we were having just a wonderful conversation about big words like theodicy and why bad things happen in life. And then the conversation shifted to what was going on in our families, and he kindly, as he always does, said, "How are you? How's your family? Your kids?" And I said immediately, "My daughter turns 13 in September." True story. And he goes, "Oh, the Odyssey is not why did bad things happen to good people. It's where is my 15-year-old daughter at midnight?" That's the question. And this is what I will tell you. I was not comforted by that. Welcome back.
Thank you, Richie. Do you realize what a gift you have in him? In fact, I just want to give it back. We have an hour. I missed being with you last week only because we have a treasure in Dr. McKenzie, and so you ask a friend, so what did he cover? And your rector wrote me back an email that was publishable. It was probably as good, if not better, than the lecture itself. I want to get right to the text, but I wanted to applaud your rector not only for bringing different perspectives to the book of Job, but as I was telling him just before, different approaches. Because for those of you who were here last week, and I wish I could have heard, and I will listen to Dr. McKenzie's lecture, his whole spiel, here's some Yiddish for you, his whole Megillah, that's the word for a scroll, seems to be, do the people who read the Bible really understand what they're reading? And the answer is largely no. Because to comprehend the Bible, we have to grasp the intentions. Now, how do we grasp the intentions? Well, we have to recognize the genres, whether it's the satire of Jonah, or knowing, for instance, that Adam and Eve are not historical characters. Adam means man, and Eve means life. And when Richard and I were talking just before, when it comes to New Testament texts, like the apocalyptic texts, the book of Revelations, if you don't understand that they were allegories of events that were happening in their own time, and that not for a moment could the writers of Revelations, for instance, imagine that centuries afterwards, readers would be poring over their works for clues to date the actual second coming of Christ, or when or how the world would end, you totally miss the point. Now, if you do that with the book of Job, as he did last week, you understand that it's really a wager between Satan and God, that it's a bet, and that because Job remains faithful, God wins the bet, and like in Tunica, you can't win if you don't play, right? And so Job is going to end up better off at the end than he did at the beginning. But that doesn't necessarily do anything for your soul, right? That doesn't, I mean, God doesn't speak until chapter 38 of this book. And it's out of the whirlwind. And Job happens every day. The story of someone you know who is suffering for no good reason. And so what I thought I would do in this wrap-up to Job is put it in the context, again, of where we started, the wisdom literature, the title of this series. Proverbs is where we have to go back to because Proverbs is a confident mood. You know, the wisdom literature, as I said 2 weeks ago, is, as we know, Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. And Job may be considered an answer to the confidence of the book of Proverbs before we get to the skepticism of the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, first, I didn't mention this 2 weeks ago. If you read the opening part of Proverbs, the introductory part expresses the purpose of all the wisdom literature. Wisdom is personified as if she were a wise mother, with her erring sons to turn back from the path of folly, you might say. So what an image. I mean, this is the whole image of the wisdom literature. And I don't want to take too much time looking at text since we're going to look at Job, but in Proverbs it says, she calls upon youth to accept the guidance of wisdom, and as a reward, if you listen to your mother, you get length of days and years of life. Wisdom is also looked upon as being a co-worker with God in creation, right? It says in this book that God founded the world by wisdom, and therefore wisdom must be obeyed. And most people forget this context for the wisdom literature because we get to all those aphorisms, all those quick maxims, right? Because the main book of Proverbs, in the book of Proverbs, which we attribute to Solomon, of course, chapters 10 through 22, are all those like two-line poetry statements. You know, similar to the style of writings in the poetic parts of the prophets. So in other words, the second line gives the opposite side of the coin, right? In contrast to the first line. So let me just give you one, because we're not going to be talking much about Proverbs, but we have to set the context for where Job fits. So in one of the Proverbs it says, a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the grief of his mother. That's the Bible. Got it. So we forget that at the end of Proverbs, the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, is part of the Sabbath ritual now for Jews. And even a lot of Jews who know this by heart, a woman of valor who can find, she's more precious than fine jewels, her husband trusts. Proverbs 31, it's part of the ritual for welcoming the Sabbath. It describes the noble woman. Some might say certain verses in it could be sexist by today's standards, but the woman who looks after the affairs of her household in wisdom, her husband's heart delights in her, her children rise up and call her blessed. So why am I sharing this with you? Because the beginning and the end of the book balance each other. They balance each other out. We start with a mother and a child, and we end with the true mother, who is the guide of the household, of her household, the queen, as it were. So the motherly guide. And the book of Job, if you think about it, we learn about Job and all he had, the wager, and then at the end, there's balance, there's restoration. But I would urge us to think about looking at Job as a restudy of Proverbs as we arrive at the skepticism of Ecclesiastes. So let me get that out of the way, and then we'll spend the rest of our time on Job, because I don't think we'll ever get to it otherwise. If Proverbs is confident, Job has us thinking this morning and every day. Ecclesiastes is bordering on pessimistic, if not skeptical, right? And what's the chief basis of Ecclesiastes' pessimism? That human life shows no progress. That one generation comes, another generation goes, and the world stays as it is. Even the pursuit of wisdom, our topic for this series, brings no satisfaction to him. Read Ecclesiastes. The more wisdom he gets, the more vexed he gets. He says pessimistically, and this is a direct quote, "He that increases wisdom increases sorrow." Wisdom or knowledge. So if there's no progress, and if even wisdom is a source of sorrow, he says, I'm just going to try to enjoy life. Go to the Grizzlies game. I'm going to enjoy pleasure. But then he finds that even this life of hilarity is boring, and it becomes meaningless after a while. And following Job, our topic, this trilogy in the wisdom literature, Ecclesiastes says, there's no justice in the world either. There's no use counting upon some future existence to make up for the sorrows of this one, because, and this is chapter 3, who knows the spirit of man, whether it goes upward? But after saying that enjoyment and joy is weary to the spirit, how does he end the book? It's kind of like, the tagline too. Not only do these wisdom books balance each other out, no matter how pessimistic it is, and I'm sure if McKenzie was here, he would tell you the last chapters, the end of Ecclesiastes is a definite add-on. He says, enjoy your youth before old age comes and before you lose your capacity for pleasure. Remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth, before the years draw nigh, when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Hey, quick factoid. This could be on CNN, the factoids. This verse became the text of the medieval Latin college song, Gaudiamus igitur. You know that? Juvenes dum sumus. Right? I don't know if your choir sings it. But what does that mean? Let us therefore rejoice while we're still young. So, we've got the confidence of Proverbs, the skepticism, even the pessimism of Ecclesiastes, and we have Job sandwiched in between. Now, Job, I don't know if Dr. McKenzie shared this, according to the prophet Ezekiel, is one of 3 righteous men, right? You know that. The other 2 are Noah and Daniel. And the question that everybody thinks about with Job is not the wager between God and Satan. It's, why do good people suffer if God is in control? Right? Why do good people suffer if God is in control? And if you think about it, even the great Holocaust theologians like Yitz Greenberg and others like him, Fackenheim, you have to answer the question of why didn't God intervene? Now you can I think a lot of the questions of theodicy have to do with not where is God, but where is man, right? We know the story of Elie Wiesel watching public executions of Jews in the death camps, and someone turns to him and says, where is God? And of course, the answer in the famous essay is God is hanging on the gallows, right? God is crying. We could quote the Psalms that God is closest to those whose hearts are crushed. Literally, that's what the Hebrew means. But there is a randomness in the world that doesn't explain all tragedy. Why did the child at St. Jude get diagnosed with cancer yesterday? What did man do? What did anyone do? So I don't want to spend all of our time rehashing the details of Job. I imagine that we're all on the same page, that Job is the father of 7 sons and 3 daughters. He was blameless and upright. He was the wealthiest man in the East. He owned thousands of sheep and camel and hundreds of oxen. And of course, God tells Satan that there's no one on earth like Job. He's a God-fearing man who shunned evil. And the devil, of course, answers cynically that it's easy for a rich man to be God-fearing, but if he loses his possessions, if you take away a rich man's possessions, he will curse God. Of course, he doesn't. God agrees that Satan, go ahead, put Job to the test. So we know all about what happens, not just to the oxen and the donkeys and camels. His sheep die in a fire. All his children are crushed to death when the house collapsed on them. Job gets up, tears his clothes, cuts off his hair, prostrates himself on the ground. You could check chapter 1, verse 21. He says, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb. Naked shall I return there. The Lord has given, the Lord has taken. Blessed be the name of the Lord." I said those words twice this week at funerals. God sees that Job didn't reproach him, told Satan that Job had been destroyed for no good reason. And what does Satan reply? Skin for skin, all that a man has he will give up for his life, but lay a hand on his bones and his flesh, and he will surely blaspheme you, God, to your face. God said to Satan, "See, he's in your power, only spare his life." Satan departs from God, and what does he do? Inflicts severe sores all over Job's body. We're told from the sole of his feet to the top of his head. And that's when Job's wife sees him sitting in ashes and scratching himself with a potsherd and says to him, "You'll still keep your integrity? Just blaspheme God and die." Job replies, "You talk as any shameless woman or man might talk. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil?" That's Job chapter 2, verses 9 to 10. And then we get the 3 friends, right? Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. I said, no Jewish family I know has ever named their kid Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, or Zophar. So these 3 friends hear about the tragedies that have happened to Job, and they come to mourn with him, to comfort him, and they come to Job, and they see that he was so changed that they almost didn't recognize him. You've seen people in grief. You know what they're talking about. So they wail and weep, and they rend their clothes, they sprinkle dust on their heads, and they sit with Job, as I said last time, for 7 days and 7 nights without speaking a word, because they saw that his grief was great. And that's the basis in Jewish mourning of sitting for 7 days. It's called Shiva. So Job finally breaks his silence with a bitter diatribe against his life, cursing the day he was born. And this outburst just blows away his friends. They came to commiserate, not to participate in a rebellion against God's judgment. And so they turn from being comforters to scolders, right? Eliphaz tells Job that he must have sinned, as there was no other way to explain God's treatment. And we know lots of people who still do that today, right? Religiously, they blame the person for their sin. Bildad if you paid attention to the reading, he ascribes the deaths of Job's children to their sins. You really want to make someone mad. And Zophar tells him, this is incredible. Zophar tells Job that God's punishment was less than what he deserved. And then a younger man, Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite, enters the scene and expresses his anger toward Job because he justified himself rather than God, and against his three friends because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. So God then says, finally, as we have said last week and the week before, it's not until chapter 38, that they're all wrong because they were not God to know it all. So God rebukes Job's friends for their presumptuous words. He orders them to go to Job, make a sacrifice, and ask Job to pray for them so that God would not punish them. And of course, we know how it all ends. God restores Job's fortune. He was comforted, consoled. He became wealthier than before. And he's the father of another 7 sons and 3 daughters. Now, before I get to theodicy, let's talk about ecology. Because the Bible makes no separation between the ecology of plants, of animals, and of people. Right? Because when God speaks up, he's going to say, who created the world, the birds, the sparrows. In case you didn't know, the word ecology comes from the Greek word oikos, or house, and it recognizes the world as our home, right? But the Hebrew goes even deeper. The Hebrew word, in case you didn't know, because the book of Job, because we're human, we're confused about evil, we're confused about tragedy and sorrow that's undeserved, that we can't explain. But the Hebrew word for nature, hateva, did you know it has the same numerical value as the word for God, Elohim? In other words, every letter in the Bible was not originally written in English, we know. It was written in Hebrew, 22 consonants, no vowels. And each consonant has a numerical equivalent. So Aleph, A is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, and so forth, all the way through all 22 consonants. And so if you add up the letters that spell the word for nature, the natural world, that God is going to show Job at the end, it's the same exact equivalent for God's name. There's even a blessing, in case you didn't know, that we're supposed to say as Jews upon seeing something beautiful in the environment. Whether it's a plant, a flower, or an animal. The blessing is Mishaneh Habriot, which goes something like this. You make such beautiful things, God, and such diverse wonders. Each species was created by you and was meant to be. Anyway, we're definitely ruining the skies and the seas, the forests and the rivers that Job talks about, the soil and the air. We're all in peril. By the way, lest you think that this is a political comment, how short our memories are that, well, let me read something to you. If corporations do not stop polluting, we must find ways to compel them to do so. Important people must be interfered with before notice will be taken of disagreeable facts. Instead of demonstrating on Fifth Avenue on behalf of baby seals, the saviors of the environment would get far better results picketing the country clubs of Nassau, Fairfield, and Morris County. It sounds like a left-wing Morris, like Mother Jones magazine. But did you know that what I just quoted to you came from the Conservative National Review? That, nowadays the political right makes jokes about spotted owls roasting on the grill, environmentalists are dismissed as wackos. But did you know it was Bill Buckley's brother, Senator James Buckley, who was a co-author of the Endangered Species Act? And that Senator John McCain's predecessor, Barry Goldwater, was the one who led the Sierra Club? I think, what if we gave them the book of Job, where Job says, just ask the animals, and they will teach you, or the birds of the air, and they will tell you, or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish of the sea inform you. Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? So I think one of the questions before we get to the human condition is what we humans have done to the world, and the question for all of us as people of faith, especially regardless of our political leanings, is what are you willing to do to take care of the environment before the situation gets any worse? Because Job says even the animals get it. So, I said to you last time that for me, Job gives the best answer to theodicy, to the question of why the bad things happen to good people, or rather, what should we do if we agree that God would never will sores from head to foot on a baby child? I mean, first of all, if we can't agree on that, then there's nothing to talk about. It's just as I've told you before, those on the far religious right who say, Rabbi, you need to know up front that, I've been taught that Jews are going to be burning in hell after they die. So, my response is always consistent. I know you're going to be surprised to see Jewish people in heaven. I just hope you're not disappointed. So, if you're going to be surprised, that's okay. From what I've read from your scripture, Jesus makes the call anyway, not your minister, right? And so Jesus is up there and he sees another Jewish brother or sister. So, but we first have to say that some had a real problem with Harold Kushner's book when bad things happen to good people. Why? Because God can take it. We just don't know. It may be God's will in a different way. Who are you to even suggest that while God may be more perfect than humanity, God is not all perfect? There's a theological school I'm trying to recall that maybe next time I'll share with you. My friend Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson, if you want to look him up, Artson, his child has severe autism, and he actually Judaized a Christian school of theology, which is a way of understanding God in the midst of our suffering and sorrow. That's different than the limited God idea. The limited God is what Kushner proposes. That is, God can't stop it. God is becoming, God is greater. Now, we could say God can't stop it because God has self-contracted to make room for us, and out of love, stuff happens. Randomness. So let's go to what I alluded to, and that is when bad things happen to good people, what are the responses? And I think our Bible and Job give us 2 of the 4 responses. Basically, there are 4 ways, general ways, and your rector probably can add additional ones. But I would say The first chapter in the book of Lamentations is one answer. The first chapter in the book of Lamentations. Another is the third chapter in the same book of Lamentations. A totally different answer. Which, by the way, ought to give you a red flag whenever you hear a rabbi, minister, or priest say, this is why it happens. If anyone ever tells any youth or adult, this is why evil happens in the world, do not trust him or her if they tell you there's only one answer. Because in the book of Lamentations alone, there are two answers, and in the book of Job, there are two answers. The first answer is Lamentations chapter 1. We can say, when tragedy strikes, as it struck Job, it's my fault and I feel guilty. It's my fault and I feel guilty. This is the context of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and the writer of first chapter of Lamentation basically says, he's searching for a reason of what sin have the people committed. It must have been our fault. Now, if you think that sounds foreign, think again. We all say in our own way, if only I had sent Mama to Florida and gotten her out of the cold weather, this would not have happened. She wouldn't have gotten pneumonia and died. Or, if I had not sent Mama to Florida and exposed her to the sudden change of climate, this would not have happened. If only I had done this, or if only I had done that. I'm sure Richard Lawson has heard this in his study, as Reverend Bush and all the other pastors in this room. I hear it all the time. We berate ourselves and torture ourselves trying to find out, what did we do wrong? And why do we do that? Because, as my teachers have taught me, and I believe this to be true, I think we would rather feel guilty than believe that what happens to us and what happens to our loved ones is sometimes a matter of chance. Randomness is harder to accept in time of loss than guilt. At least for some people. Randomness is harder to accept in times of loss for some people than guilt. My own mother, to make it personal, my father, may he rest in peace, died of lymphoma. We were playing tennis. My son and my father beat me and another partner in doubles in August. He dies in October from this rare form of lymphoma. Lymphoma, like cancer, has at least 40 different kinds. And then you read in Newsweek magazine, new cures, this treatment, that treatment. So I try to reassure my mother that it was random. There was no way, if we had given Dad that, if we had given, as if he would have survived, you don't know. And it only is reinforced when you hear about other people who found ways to survive. So that's only one response. The other is, we can say, not it's my fault and I feel guilty, but it's God's fault. And pardon the French, but there was a movie called Network back in the 70s, if any of you have seen, where the people open the window and they say, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. It's God's fault and I feel angry. That's chapter 3, 2 chapters later in the book of Lamentations, as we get to Job's answers, which I think are better. But this is also very natural. The author of the book of Lamentations, it's worse than the stock market crashing. God's house burned down. The temple burned down, right? And so, how could you do this, God? I'm mad. What does he call God? A lion, a bear, a hunter. Uses all kinds of other images to express God's relentless pursuit of him. And then the author of Lamentations in chapter 3 retreats because he realizes, oh my God, he's my boss. I can't talk to him that way. Because God is powerful. And if he did that to Jerusalem, God knows what he could do to me. How dare I shake my fist at him and accuse? But anger like this in a time of grief and sorrow is very understandable. And that is why, in Jewish tradition, we rip a garment when we stand at the grave. We don't gash ourselves, as they did in antiquity. You'll often see Jews cut a tie or have a black ribbon that's cut. It's a therapeutic, sanctioned way of expressing the anger we feel at such a time as this. Which brings us to the chapter of Job that we finally get to, that finally chapter 38 offers a completely different answer. The author of Job 38, the answer is not that calamity is our fault or that tragedy is God's will, but that tragedy is something built into the order of creation. And it's something beyond the capacity of human beings to comprehend. And that's when we get the ecology, the mystery, the wonder, the awe of not just being, but of the universe. When we contemplate, I'm paraphrasing chapter 38, when we contemplate the awesomeness of the cosmos. One of my greatest moments as a college student, this is why I ended up going to my alma mater. I walk in, and there's Carl Sagan teaching a class at Cornell, talking about billions and billions of galaxies. You remember his voice, right? When we contemplate the awesomeness of the cosmos, when we realize how intricate are the stars and the planets, the birds and nature. The sun rose again this morning. The sun will set again tonight. Who are we, puny creatures, here for just a while to complain, question, or worse, claim that we figured it all out? Because if we knew God's ways, then we would be God. The world's too much for us. And if evil happens, what can we do? So that's the third answer. It's no one's fault, Job says in 38. But what can you do? This response of Job, I think, teaches resignation and humility in a world beyond our ability to comprehend or understand. And I think we all would agree. But that's not the final answer. The author of the last chapter of the book of Job may offer the wisest answer. Chapter 42. He doesn't say, well, he agrees that it's no one's fault, but he doesn't say, what can you do? He says, now that it's happened, what can I do? What can we do? He tells of how Job gets up off his knees and dares to live and love again. He tells of how Job, after having lost children, dares to bring new children into the world, even though only he knows that every time you have a child, you may lose him or her. This Job in 42 teaches us not to wail and to lament, not to sink into passivity or bitter anger, but to focus instead on what you can do to make things better after you've been struck a cruel blow. And if any of you have lost children, God forbid, I was with 2 of our members this week who have lost children. The courage to live again. That's why Eve is my hero in the Bible, because the first mother loses 2 kids on the same day. You don't think about this. It's not just that Cain killed Abel. Cain is made to be a wanderer for the rest of his life, right? She loses both kids on the same day. And what did Adam and Eve do? One of the most beautiful lines in the whole Bible. V'yada, they, I want to say, made love again. They knew each other. They made love. They had another child. And the child's name is Seth, which means a gift. And if you look at the way the Bible records, it doesn't substitute Cain and Abel. The way that Seth is introduced, it's almost introduced as in the wake of their loss. And then Seth has a child named Enosh, which is the word for humanity. So that means humanity, we are descended not from a killer, and not from a victim, but from a woman and her husband who were brave enough to live again and dared to live again. So here you have at least 4 answers side by side within the tradition, and I think 2 of them, the best ones come from Job. If you want to stop at the resignation and humility, that can still enable you to move forward. But families of survivors of suicide, or the worst imaginable deaths, losing child. I'm not minimizing the death of a parent by any means, but that's why Harold Kushner did not call his book "If Bad Things Happen to Good People," but when bad things happen to good people, because they always do. When bad things happen to us, we have these 4 choices that we can make. We can say, it's my fault, and I feel guilty. It's God's fault, and I'm mad as hell. It's no one's fault, but what can you do? Or it's no one's fault, but what can I do? What can we do? And how faith shapes our lives, whether not just as Episcopalians and Jews, but how faith in general shapes our lives, depends on which of these 4 choices we make. And I'll stop now. Thank you. And questions, please. Questions that you may have. I realized last time I didn't leave enough time. We need to stop at 10:20, correct? We only have we have 10 minutes. I'm sorry if I spoke too long. Okay. Yes, questions? Please. I mentioned whom? Yeah, Brad Artson, A-R-T-S-O-N.
I didn't quite get what he said.
Yeah, he has a way of deepening one's faith in God by not explaining his son's autism as a sign of God's will, but as a sign of deepening and growing and learning from the wonder of his son himself. I'm not being as clear as, it's a school of theology that comes out of the Protestant church, and I'm forgetting its name, but if you look up Artson, A-R-T-S-O-N, he's written extensively on this. So that's what I would recommend. There's not going to be enough time in 5 minutes for me to explicate it anyway. But I think, when it comes to death, parents always come to me, how do I explain death to my child? I always say, first, you have to explain it to yourself, so why don't we talk about that? So I think everyone here needs a theology when it comes to theodicy. We all have to explain how we make sense of it. To me, Job 42 is the best. Job 38 I can relate to. And Artson has given me a new direction. Yes?
Why is Job not an Israelite? He's a Midianite?
It's a great question, and it relates to something I probably threw away in my opening sentence 2 weeks ago. What makes the wisdom literature, the title of this rector's series, the wisdom literature, is that it doesn't relate anything specific to Israel or the children of Israel. That's what makes these 3 books. They're human questions with human answers, but the answers are deeply Jewish, even though they apply to everyone. And so he came from the land of Uz. By the way, as I shared last time too, in the Talmud, they don't believe that Job actually existed, that Job is every man, that Job wasn't a specific person, that Job is you and me. That's why. So yes, nothing specific to the Jewish people about Job, but specific to everyone, including Jewish people, and of course you and everyone else you know. So good question. Yes, others please. Yes, ma'am.
Is it possible through the grieving process?
Through the what? Grieving process.
To go through different phases from what did I do wrong to what can I do?
Yes, and it may sound morbid, but I think Judaism is at its best, deriving a lot of it from Job's story, when it comes to death and mourning, because it's not easy to live in this world. Even if somebody lives to 95, right? Well, someone lost their mother, she was 89, lived a great life. But, I said to her, okay, so it's not a tragedy, but in some ways it's harder. Because how can you imagine living in this world without her in it? The longer someone lives, the more inconceivable it is to be in this world without them in it. So the 7 days are the most intense, where you may vent at home the first 3 days, 7 days, whatever, and then returning to life takes time. So the next period after the 7 days is 30 days. And I may have given you this example, I don't know, stop me if I did, but my wife, we were married in Montgomery, Alabama. I'm from Jacksonville, Florida. I thought I was raised in the South till I went to Montgomery. Jacksonville was like Manhattan compared to Montgomery. Our wedding started, the ceremony was on a Saturday night, but it started on Tuesday, and it ended on Sunday. And I may have told Richard, I almost broke off, I was courting my wife, and we had these great engagement parties. I was introduced to her friends, families, and most of them are not Jewish, of course, but these are fine people, lawyers. I don't know if the Tate firm was there, but you have your lawyers, doctors, and I almost ended the engagement before it really took off, because I almost asked the question. There was this guy on every wall in every study, and it wasn't Jesus. And then I heard one guy said, "John, that's the nicest Bear Bryant oil I've ever seen." I was this close to asking who he was. So, my wife's Aunt Muriel's close relative died within 3 weeks of our wedding. And so what does she do? She was very close to Aunt Muriel, taking her to Israel next month. This is 24 years ago, and so what does she do? The tradition protects you because it has respect for your pain. What it says is, go to the ceremony if you want, but use Judaism as your excuse not to go to the party. How can I dance at a wedding and act like everything's well? There's no embalming in Judaism, by the way, because the last right a person should have is utter privacy. There's no open casket. You give the person the dignity and the privacy. One of the most beautiful, the most important institution to establish in a community is not a synagogue, but a burial society, where you prepare loved ones for death. The traditional burial shroud has no pockets. The rabbis say we come into the world like this, like a baby with clenched hands. We leave like this. Everything is left here. But going on takes time. I mean, grief counselors will tell you, 2 years sometimes for people. It's very hard to know. Grief is not linear. So those stages, I think you're right, they're not discrete. We may go through all of them at a different point. But if you're able to, and here's the thing, you never know who's going to find a way to make it to that fourth response of Job. In other words, widows, amazes me, how some are not able to function and some rock the world. They find a way to carry forward their husband or their wife's legacy. And then, of course, the whole grief process can't be prescriptive. You can't tell another person. Everyone feels a loss in a slightly different way, which is why, by the way, at the gravesite, you ever see the shoveling of earth in Jewish funerals? The main rule is you don't pass the shovel to someone else. Why? Because everyone feels this loss in a slightly different way. 10 kids, each one had a different relationship with mom or dad, or grandma, grandpa. Other question right up here, please.
Yes. Doesn't the Spirit usually enter through our woundedness, through our brokenness?
Yes, in fact, the rabbi said there's nothing more whole than a broken heart. That is true. Yeah, karov Adonai, God is close to those who are wounded and broken. That's true. But theology always works in like Trezevin Hall, but it doesn't work in the hospital room. You tell someone who's writhing in pain from the last stages of cancer that, the Spirit's working in you now. Of course, that would be it would be the last thing that you seem like a fine gentleman, would ever say. So that's where theology is really great to talk about in a rector's forum until it happens to you, right? But I do think there is a way to arrive at, yes, that God is with me. And we all suffer, but to glorify suffering, I mean, that's why I think the problem with Mel Gibson's movie is that, the Passion took me 12 minutes to read when I read in the New Testament. What's this 3 hours? Talk about the resurrection. Talk about light and life. I mean, that's the message of Christ, isn't it? It's not just let's scratch the blood out, right? So, others, please. And then final one, our rector is standing. Thank you for having me.